All right. So, like I said a moment ago, we're going to be reading the Canterbury Tales, which is written and set during the medieval period in medieval England. The medieval period is a long period of time, and this is stuff that you guys I'm sure already know from world history. But just to kind of touch up on it or to brush up on it for this story, I'm going to go over some of the basics again. The medieval period, also called the Middle Ages, is a long period of time, depending on how you measure it. And different historians and different scholars have, slightly different ideas of what constitutes the Middle Ages. But to call it the medieval period or the Middle Ages is a little bit of a misnomer because it's usually divided up into three sort of distinct sections: the early Middle Ages, the high Middle Ages, and the late Middle Ages. The period as a whole, the long Middle Ages, I guess you could say, starts with basically starts with the fall of the Roman Empire. And from the quiz that you took yesterday and the notes that we took last week before reading Beowulf, yeah, you'll have to catch up on that. You might remember that the Roman Empire lost control of England in circa 410 A.D., and that is kind of roughly coinciding with the fall of the Roman Empire as a whole. So the beginning of the Middle Ages sort of coincides with the fall of the Roman Empire in Europe, and the Middle Ages continues for about 1,000 years until the beginning of the Renaissance period. And so we'll talk really briefly about the three different phases of the Middle Ages: the early, the high, and the late Middle Ages. All right, so the early Middle Ages, when Rome falls, and particularly in Britain or in England, when Rome falls, it coincides with the Anglo-Saxon takeover. The Roman period is sometimes called antiquity, and the early Middle Ages is a transition from that period of antiquity into the more modern era, this new thing that will eventually be known by historians as the Middle Ages. Sometimes the early Middle Ages is actually called the late antiquity because it is, as with any historical period, it is a transition. It's not, like on a certain date the Middle Ages begin and antiquity ends. It's a transition that takes a while. And so sometimes you'll see it called late antiquity. Other times you'll see it called the Dark Ages. But I think that this is something you really don't see that much anymore. At least not in any kind of real academic scholarship. I don't think people generally talk about the Dark Ages anymore. I remember when I was younger, kind of learning, and whether I learned this in school or if I just learned this from the world, from hearing things on, seeing things on TV and popular culture and media and mythology and everything. I don't know where this idea came from for me, but the idea that I had was that the Dark Ages was this period of time in Europe when everybody was illiterate and knowledge was declining and nobody knew anything, and we forgot about how to do math. The culture, European culture in general, forgot how to do math, forgot how to do science, forgot how to read, forgot how to do all these things. And that it wasn't until the Renaissance, which actually, when we get to the Renaissance in a couple of weeks, Renaissance actually is a word that means the rebirth or rejuvenation. And the idea was that it wasn't until the Renaissance that Europe started to regain all that intellectual prowess, the philosophy and the math and the science and all that stuff. But that's really not true. It's kind of more like people in one period just thinking about all the great knowledge that they have and looking back on the period for people who were alive 200 years ago and thinking about how stupid they were because they didn't know all these things that we do. It would be the equivalent of us today looking back on the 16th and 17th centuries in America or Europe for that matter, and thinking like, oh, those people who came and the first people who came to America, they were so stupid because they didn't even have iPhones. How could they have possibly known anything if they couldn't Google it? They were so unsophisticated, which is completely not true. I mean, this is it was a period of great scholarship and great thought. But when we judge things by the standards that we judge them today, they're very different a couple hundred years ago. And there was that mentality even in the Middle Ages of people in say the 11, 1200s looking back 400 or 500 years and thinking about how far behind their ancestors had been with some of their knowledge. But in reality, even in the early Middle Ages, there was great scholarship being done. There were there was scholarship, there was philosophy, world navigation. There was all kinds of great stuff that was going on back then, and it just got better and better over the course of the next 1,000 years. Religion plays a huge role all throughout the Middle Ages. I mean, as it does today still. But the Middle Ages in Europe plays a major role. Religion plays a major role. The relatively new religion of Islam starts to spread fairly rapidly, across northern Africa and Spain. And Christianity spreads equally, if not more so, as rapidly as Islam is spreading across Europe. Christianity is not quite as new as Islam, but still is one of the relative newcomers on the world religion scene. And the Pope, or the papacy, is what the office that the Pope holds is referred to as. The papacy is becoming an increasingly influential office. So whoever's the Pope in the early middle period is starting to become a pretty powerful person. The more Christianized Europe becomes, the more followers, the more adherents the Pope has. And as we know from studying history of any period, what are some of the things that any person who's in charge of any organization, whether it's a city or a local government, or if it's a country, or if it's a massive company, organization, a church, what are things that are going to make somebody very powerful and influential? What are important things that are going to help somebody become a powerful figure? What? Money. Well, Chris and Ryan both said one of the first things that comes to my mind is money. And the state can tax you, right? The government can tax you, and the church, they might not call it a tax specifically, but they are collecting money from their parishioners in one way or another. When we read the Canterbury Tales, one of the stories that we're going to read that's one of the chapters, or one of the stories in the Canterbury Tales, is called The Pardoner's Tale, and it's it's a satire of how corrupt, and this is a few hundred years later. This is in the late Middle Ages that this story takes place, but it's how corrupt church officials have become when it comes to collecting money in the name of the church. So even in the early Middle Ages, the Pope and the church in general is becoming very powerful because lots of members from the church all over Europe, and all of those members are sending money back to the church. So it's getting more and more powerful all the time. The High Middle Ages is the middle of the Middle Ages, the middle period of the Middle Ages. And specifically, when we're talking about British history, we can use the Norman invasion in 1066 as sort of the guide point for when, to approximate the beginning of the High Middle Ages. And when you think of medieval culture, I mean, anytime anytime the word medieval pops into your mind, the things that you're probably thinking of, the styles, the fashion, the art, the culture, the politics, if you have any impression of what medieval life is like, you're probably thinking about the High Middle Ages, this period of time right in the middle of this couple hundred years, right in the middle of the Middle Ages. So you're talking like a lot of your old kind of fairy tales and stories, Robin Hood, that type of thing. Some of the things that are going on during this period of time, and remember, this is coming out of what would be considered by people even during the High Middle Ages, during these years. It's going to be considered by some people to be the couple hundred years earlier is going to be considered to be called the Dark Ages, or this time of intellectual despair. And part of the reason for that is that in the High Middle Ages, you've got a really massive expansion of knowledge, literacy, I guess, for some. You've got the establishment of some of the great European universities. There are universities in Paris, in Italy, and in Oxford in England, among others. These great universities that last hundreds and hundreds of years and are still operating today as some of the great universities of the world. You also have something that was referenced in the video that we watched yesterday, which is the construction of these great stone structures, stone buildings that are built to last. At the beginning of the video we watched yesterday, he mentioned the presenter, the host of the show, mentioned that London in the Middle Ages transitioned from being a city of wood to a city of stone. And if you walk around, or if you look around, particularly the old part of London, the square mile at the center of the city, you'll see that there's so much history there from the Middle Ages because those buildings were built during this period of time to be permanent. The Tower of London, and you got cathedrals, and you've got palaces and castles, and all over Europe you've got these great massive stone buildings that are built to be permanent. Magna Carta in Britain, in England, is adopted as it's kind of forced actually on the king by some of the certainly not the peasants, but some of the barons and the noblemen of noble subjects of the king. But they kind of forced this Magna Carta, this document, this agreement on the king, which restricts the power that the king has, restricts some of the things that he can do, and it basically is this document that says here's a list of things the king can do, and here's a list of responsibilities, obligations that he has to his people. And this is a pretty revolutionary idea, but it actually, to this day, Magna Carta is the foundation of the British Constitution, and the idea of something like the Magna Carta is the foundation for systems of government and society all over the world. And so that's at this point almost 1,000 years ago from today's date. And back on to the topic of religion, which is something that I think is important to think about as you proceed through the Middle Ages. When it comes to the topic of religion, at this point, by the High Middle Ages, all over Europe, the society is Christianized. Christianity has spread and covered all over Europe. The papacy at this point is extremely powerful, and it's leading to it leads to conflicts between the church and governments in the world. It seems like the church is constantly having some kind of disagreement, sometimes serious disagreements with kings and rulers of one country or another. Wars are being fought in the Middle Ages, religious wars, the Holy Wars, the Crusades. By the end of the Middle Ages, the political conflict between the church and government actually comes, as you all know, comes to a head when the King of England, Henry VIII, has a disagreement with the Pope over over who's the boss, sort of. And Henry VIII eventually starts his own church. Tells the Pope, tries to tell the Pope exactly how much the king, the king respects the Pope's authority, which is to say, 0. To simplify it, yeah. To simplify it, I mean, there's a lot more to it politically than just that. But I think that was the impetus. That was the catalyst that got it all started. Yeah. All right, and the late Middle Ages, the last 200 years or so of this period, of the medieval period, the late Middle Ages. The late Middle Ages is Chaucer's period. Geoffrey Chaucer, the author of the Canterbury Tales, it's his period of time. It's the time that we're going to be looking at as we read the Canterbury Tales, and this is the way that the early Middle Ages, the beginning of the Middle Ages, was a transition from antiquity into a more modern world. The late Middle Ages is kind of a transition, a forced transition between this period of time and the next phase of civilization in Europe in particular. The late Middle Ages contains a lot of kind of cataclysmic events. These really disastrous events, disastrous, big, huge, kind of global or international tragedies. The 100 Years' War between England and France, which is actually longer than 100 years. You've got, particularly in the early period, the early part of the late Middle Ages, you've got these famines, this series of bad weather, of some of the worst weather that Europe had experienced in a long time, as well as political incompetence, government inefficiencies. The kind of concentration of wealth and power among people who were either not able to or not interested in using their power and their money and their influence to help people below their station. Bad weather and all these social issues, social problems, lead to a series of famines that caused tons and tons of deaths in Europe. And then, of course, the Black Plague, the Black Death, that in less than a decade eradicated, depending on whose numbers you use, between 30 and 60% of the population of Europe. And if you look at,
That's a big march.
It is, yeah, and it depends. And also, if you look at it, it started. The plague started in the lower, the kind of southern portion of the world, so further down towards the Mediterranean, around southern Italy. It started down there, and then it moved year after year. It moved further and further north. So if you look at the number of, if you think about it in terms of country or region. A place like Italy or someplace or Greece, someplace on the Mediterranean, some of those places lost as much as 80% of the population of their countries to this disease. And then places like northern Germany or even England, where they still had massive casualties, massive deaths as a result of the Black Plague, because it got there. It got to those places later, and because the weather, the cold weather wasn't as conducive to the plague multiplying and spreading as fast as it does in warmer, more humid environments. Places like Northern Europe, Germany, England, saw proportionally less of their population. But even still, you're talking in those places like 20, 30, 40% of the population of the country being killed by the plague. So over the course of a couple of decades, the population of Europe is cut in half or more than, even more than in half. Huge, huge, huge demographic changes, huge, massive population changes. Think of it in terms of today in America. We have issues. If you watch the news, you know that we've got issues in America. We've got unemployment issues. We've got stock market issues, economy issues. But imagine if you took the issues that we're having today of economy, unemployment, all those things. Imagine if you took that and then in the next 3 years, we saw a disease come in that eradicated 150 million people from the just killed 150 million people, American people. Hmm? If you were lucky, you'd spontaneously combust. The Black Plague was pretty foul, pretty unpleasant way to die. So imagine the consequences. Imagine the consequences that has, not on a personal level for the individual and the family. I mean, that's bad enough. But imagine the consequences that all this death from wars, from famine, and from disease. Imagine the consequences that all this stuff has on things like the economy, the markets. It completely rearranges things. And I think that it's safe to say, and of course it's a complicated enough issue that that you talk to 10 historians or 10 scholars and everybody's going to have a different opinion somewhat on exactly how this happens. But I think that it's safe to say that most of them would agree that it's stuff like these things, these big events that cause half the population, cause a decline of 30, 40, 50, 60% of the population. It's those things that sort of force the shift from the way they worked in the Middle Ages to the way that the world works in the Renaissance, in the Renaissance and going forward. One of the things that you can think about is, again, put it in the context of today. We have this issue that you hear about all the time today of unemployment, right? Not enough jobs to go around, not enough jobs for everybody. Well, imagine if half the people who are working are dead in the next 2 years. You got a lot of jobs to fill, right? A lot of jobs to fill. More jobs that need to be done than you have people who can do them. So if right now the unemployment rate I think is something like 9%. Is it? Okay, so it's lower. So it's like 6 or 7%. So let's say that let's say just because I'm bad at math that it's 10. Let's say that it's 10%. And then half the country dies between now and 2016. So in 2016, if unemployment holds steady and is still 10% and 50% of the working population dies, then that's, that's a lot of jobs. A lot of jobs might not need to be filled, but in today's economy, and that might be true. It might be true, Nathan. So don't get the plague, okay? But I mean, it does make you think that it does make you think about it though, in the sense of jobs, employment, labor, and remember that this is that in an agricultural society, crops need to be planted and harvested. Land needs to be worked, and the people who own the land under the system that they had back then, the people who own the land didn't have anybody to work their land anymore because all the peasants who used to work, all the people who used to work their land, they're all dead now. And so what you had by the late Middle Ages, after the plague and after these wars, after the population had declined so much, what you end up having is a much smaller group of the lower class, but people in the lower class had much more economic power because they were more in demand. It wasn't like it had been once upon a time when you don't want to do the job. Well, I'll find 25 other people who can do the job who can do the job instead. It wasn't like that. Now it's at a point where the landowners have more land than they know what to do with, and they don't have anybody who can work it. And so this phenomenon of depopulation leads to a whole restructuring of the way that that European agricultural system worked. Peyton?
I was just wondering, did they have like forms of cancer back then like they do today?
I'm sure, yeah. I mean,
Did they like
I don't know. I don't know if they called things I don't know what they called cancer or what they identified as cancer, but I'm sure they did. I mean, I know that I don't know about the Middle Ages, but I know that in the 16 and 1700s, you see people talking about cancer fairly frequently. Was that a no? Okay. All right, and this brings us to the Canterbury Tales, to Geoffrey Chaucer. The Canterbury Tales is written during this period of the late Middle Ages. Chaucer is born in around 1343. He's considered today to be the father of English literature. That's kind of a common name for him. And the Canterbury Tales is the most well-known thing that he wrote. It's a frame narrative, and we've read frame narratives over the years, frame stories. We've seen these before. What is a frame story or frame narrative? Anybody know? Remember? I'm trying to think of one that we've read in the past. I know we've talked about these before. I'm trying to think of one. I don't know. I know that we've talked about it, but I can't think of when. A frame narrative is it's like a story within a story. And so the way that the Canterbury Tales works as a frame narrative is it starts off with this guy who's gathering up a group of people in a tavern in London, and they're all going to go on this trip 60 miles away to Canterbury on this religious pilgrimage. They're all gathering in this tavern so they can go on this trip together, and they've got a guide. It's like a little tour guide, and they're going to go on this little excursion. And in the tavern, they make an agreement that while they're on their trip, to keep themselves occupied, one of the things that's going to be kind of like the cost of admission is that if you're going to come on this trip, you have to agree to tell stories to keep us all entertained. They didn't have radios, they didn't have iPods, so they're not. So they don't want to be bored. So they're going to tell each other stories, and that's the price of joining this group. You have to be willing to tell a story, and so the frame narrative is like the main part of the story is the trip to from London to Canterbury, but that along the way they stop the story of the trip to Canterbury to tell the story that one of the members of the group tells. So it talks a little bit about the tavern, and then they kind of segue into the knight's tale, and then the knight tells his story, and then when the knight's story is over, they come back to the group and talk about a little bit what's going on in the group, and then the miller interrupts the knight, and you think that it's going to go on to the next person's story, but the miller interrupts and he tells his story instead, and then they tell the miller's story, and so it just goes on and on like this. So it's kind of a story that operates on two levels: the frame, and then the picture within the frame. So that's the frame narrative. The characters in the Canterbury Tales represent a pretty wide, kind of diverse cross section of English middle class society. You've got everybody from the knight and the squire, these sort of courtly, noble figures, to really lowbrow tradesmen, like the miller. You've got women represented, like the prioress and the wife of Bath. You've got the clergy represented, like the pardoner, the parson, summoner. So you've got a lot of different types of people who are all telling their stories, and each story is, for the most part, each story it satirizes a different part of English culture. So you'll see satire of politics, satire of religion, satire of sort of nobility, satire of the concept of courtly, kind of the courtly romance, you know, the stories about knights in shining armor and things like that. So all these different things and more are satirized. And what is satire? It's a way to sort of shine a light on something in a way that is calling some kind of attention to it in a humorous way, but to kind of shame or draw negative attention to it, you know, to show how something is either corrupt or absurd or just plain wrong, and hopefully to make you laugh while you're doing it. This is just a picture of a map that I found that shows you roughly the journey that they go on, starting at a tavern that's here in London, and then eventually navigating down here to Canterbury. It's like 60 miles. 62 miles according to Google Maps, but I don't know if that's highway miles, you know. So it's a good walk, you know, probably a couple days. It's not a huge journey, but it's something you'd plan for in advance. And one last thing that I wanted to point out: we are going to be looking mostly at, pretty much exclusively, we're going to be reading the Modern English translation that's in your textbook, which is, it's Modern English. It's not terribly hard to read. The original text that was written in Middle English. Now I put up on the screen here, I put the original language of the first couple of lines, and in a minute I want to go back and show you no, you don't have to write this down, other than the fact that it's in Middle English, but other than that you don't have to write down like the text. In a second I'll go back and compare Old English of Beowulf to the Middle English of the Canterbury Tales, and you can see how different that is.